Okay, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're tuning in from the US. Thanks for joining us in today's webinar, covering the latest developments being made in item level reporting across the supply chain. For those of you that joined us a couple of weeks ago for our webinar on RFID for the supply chain, today will be a sort of continuation of that, where we deep dive into one of the more overlooked but really valuable things unlocked with RFID in the supply chain, which is huge amounts of item level data. So I will pass you on to the man who's going to tell you all about it, Detego Senior Data Scientist, Simon Walk. Good afternoon, Simon.
Joel, thank you. Okay, I'm going to tell you today a little bit about our global track and trace and, as Joel said, item level reporting from source to store. Before I'm diving into this topic, just a few words on what we actually do at Detego and why we are the ones who actually tell you about this global track and trace and RFID along the supply chain. So we provide RFID software solutions for retailers, and particularly for the global track and trace, RFID provides a lot of benefits. First of all, real-time data, and actually a lot of real-time data that we collect. Inventory visibility, because we know which items are actually where, not only in store, but also along the supply chain. Supply chain traceability. We know when items are actually at certain locations. And we also have increased product availability because we know when items arrive at certain locations. So we know the dwell times between locations and can create reorder advices in time so that we can increase product availability. Some of our customers that actually also use global track and trace are Adidas, Levi's, and also Bestseller. So before I'm going to dive into all the details about the global track and trace and also the EPCIS, I will briefly outline how does this actually work. What is RFID? What are EPCs? Because it's important to understand what an EPC is and how does this all of this work. So if we look at the traditional supply chain of fashion retailers, then we would start out in the factory where every single article or item is tagged with an RFID tag. Once they are tagged, they get packed into cartons and shipped off to the distribution center. So this process is what we call source tagging. When they are packed, before they are sent to the distribution centers, there is a usually tunnel installation where these cartons are actually read via an RFID-based tunnel, and a target list is created for the inbound scan that afterwards happens at the distribution centers. And if the target lists don't match, we can actually trigger automatic reordering. And if the target list should actually match, then we know that something went wrong during the transport from the factory to the distribution centers. So actually what this whole process does of introducing RFID is allowing us to monitor and quantify KPIs along the supply chain, allowing us to create efficient and accurate operations. Once all the articles, once the items have arrived in the warehouse, everything gets repackaged, and after another outbound scan gets to the store. In the stores, we have again something that we call goods receiving, which essentially is an inbound scan with a mobile handheld reader. And there again, we have the target list created from the warehouse that we can check against in the stores. And the interesting thing is that in the stores, we now have RFID tagged items, so articles and products, which we can then use to create new services and insights for our customers. So I will first start with a little bit of background of RFID tags and EPCs. So RFID tag, whenever we talk about RFID tags, we talk about the hardware. So those are these small, tiny chips that are put on the labels of articles. And everything that happens with these is they encode a unique number, which allows us to uniquely identify every single tagged item. This number that is encoded in these RFID tags is called EPC, which refers to electronic product code, and is a very, very large number. So because every single item can be uniquely identified, so it needs to be a very large number. And whenever such an RFID tag is read by an RFID reader, the tag simply answers with its EPC. So it basically just says, I'm 4123186BEF and so on. And in our system, we can actually match this EPC to one specific item in the inventory of one of our customers. In contrast, SKUs only allow us to identify product types of given size, meaning 2 t-shirts with the same style can have the same SKU. So if it's a white t-shirt with a big brand logo on the front in size medium, they have the same SKU, but they have different EPCs. And what's also important to know about RFID is that you do not need direct line of sight to actually read RFID tags. So there can be several meters distance between the reader and the tag, and we'll still be able to account for that specific RFID tag. So RFID tags are the hardware. EPCs is what's encoded on this tag, the number encoded on the tag. And one term that you might have actually already come along is the EPCIS, which is the Electronic Product Code Information System. And the main idea of this EPCIS is to store all read events of RFID tags along the supply chain in one system and make it queryable from this one specific system. As you can imagine, the read events are actually manifold. I have already mentioned 3 different types of read events: the outbound scan, the inbound scan, and receiving. And all of this information is actually contextual information. And there is much more contextual information available, such as sales or stock takes. So in this EPCIS, we store all the read events that actually happen. And every single read event always refers to one uniquely identifiable EPC, meaning one uniquely identifiable item in your inventory. Every read is tracked and stored in the EPCIS, and all events stored using the GS1 standard. Using this system, using this EPCIS, you can actually track every individual item via the EPC. So think of it as a Google search for your products, where you enter the EPC, you scan it basically via a mobile reader, and then you get displayed all the events in a chronological order that are associated with this specific EPC. And using this information, so this is just basically the history of this EPC. We also know when items arrive and depart from sites along the supply chain, and events are retrievable not just by their EPC, but for example, also by site or by action or by process. So site could mean, give me all the EPC events that actually happened in my store at Oxford Street. Action meaning all the sell events that happened there. The process means everything that has to do with goods receiving in this specific store, for example. So EPCIS is this global database, big database, where all these read events are actually stored, indexed, and made queryable, so that you have this history of where your items were. And this is actually how it could look like. So here we entered one specific EPC. We know that this EPC refers to this specific shoe. We have some master data for this specific shoe. So we know that it's petrol neon, certain size and so on. And with the global track and trace, we also get historic information. So the first time we saw this specific shoe was actually the inbound process in store Champs-Élysées in the back room with a mobile reader too. Second time we saw this shoe was during a stock take, still in the back room in the same store, the day after it was received. Then on the same day, we've actually done a relocation. So we relocated the shoe from the backroom to the sales floor using the transfer station 1. And the next day, we actually sold the shoe on the sales floor at a point of sale station 3. So this is basically what an EPCIS gets you on a very, very high level. But already just displaying this kind of information is actually quite difficult because there are several challenges assigned to having such global track and trace, or EPCIS, namely big data storage, big data processing pipelines. So a lot of customers approached us and asked us, they want to build their own EPCIS, they want to build their own global track and trace. What do they need? And the first and biggest challenge is you need to work with big data. So when you conduct daily stock takes, or you get in a store with an inventory size of 40,000 items, this store roughly generates 42,500 events per day. So this 40,000 for the stock take and some more for replenishment, some more for sales and goods receiving, outbound, and so on. This means that 800 stores produce roughly 34 million read events on a single day. And if you want to store 1 month of data, you would have to store 1 billion read events just for these 800 stores, not including factories and DCs. And you also, you just don't have to store the data, you also have to process the data and calculate KPIs. And the calculation actually needs to be near real time because you want to act on the KPIs that you actually get. So that's one of the challenges that we faced in the past. And data collection along the supply chain is also very tricky because every RFID component needs to send events to this EPCIS. So it has to be connected somehow, meaning you have certain connectivity requirements and you need standardized interfaces so that you can include third-party support. So to give you an overview, more or less, this is how such an infrastructure could look like. So in the middle, we have the global track and trace, or the EPCIS, where we store all the events that are actually generated in the distribution centers, in the stores, also with the point of sale, and which is not depicted here, also in factories. And using this centralized data storage, we can then apply big data pipelines, transformation pipelines, to extract KPIs that headquarter and then afterwards use to create reports and actually act on the data that they have received. So I have already mentioned quite a few times EPCIS and global track and trace. For now, it was very interchangeable, but there is a difference between an EPCIS and the global track and trace. And actually, the difference is if an EPC is not enough or only the start, then you want to look at the global track and trace, which actually allows you to not just store EPC data, but more contextual data than you could do with an EPCIS. So in an EPCIS, tracking of items usually starts with the inception or initial tagging of an item, but usually this is not where the supply chain starts. So the supply chain is not at the end of the factory, but supply chain is actually at the cotton farm where batches of cotton are sent to the factory. And with our global track and trace, we enrich and link this EPC data with additional sources of information, for example, carton barcode, advanced shipping notifications. And what's also important, we also have events that do not have EPC data. So where this EPC data is abstracted from the event. So think of batches of cotton that are sent to the factory. And this actually allows us to expand the utility and functionality of such an EPCIS, as we can, as I said before, send charges of cotton at the cotton farm, merge raw materials into products, combined sales in stores, which we can store. So if you would only think of a traditional EPCIS, you would see that an EPC was sold in a store and you have a reference number to your point of sale system. With the global track and trace, we would actually allow you to link this sale event into the global track and trace. So you basically can click on the sale event, know which articles were actually bought together without having to switch between systems. So, and what's more important, or actually the most important point, is you can track from source to store, meaning from cotton farm to store, which is also important for these endeavors of proof of sustainability along the supply chain. So what does this actually mean when we say enriching data? Actually, if you look at this, if you look at this example, then what we would do in the global track and trace is in the inbound process, we would add a carton reference number, because we know in the inbound which carton this article was in. And actually this inbound number is clickable. So suddenly we can actually jump to a different abstraction level and check the history of carton. So we have, okay, this carton was sent from customer X, the status is complete, it was received by store 44397 in the last event with a target and how many items were read. And of course, we have the complete history of this carton. So in DC in Atlanta, we received in the inbound again with tunnel 1 this item on May 11th. And the supplier was one supplier with a specific GLN. Apparently, something went wrong during the first read, and this DC has a recirculation lane. So we read this carton 1 minute later again in tunnel 3, which is the recirculation tunnel. Then from what we can see in our history, the scan was okay, and we could always, if we would click on show contents, we could always see the contents of the cartons, the target list, and if everything matches up. Here, everything was working okay. So the carton was then routed to the outbound, where tunnel 4 actually read this carton. We know the receiver GLN, which basically is the store in Champs-Élysées that I've shown you before. And finally, the carton was actually received using goods receiving and handheld 2 at Champs-Élysées on May 12th. And a few minutes after that, we would actually see the goods receiving inbound scan of one of the EPCs that was in this carton that I've shown you before. But this is not enough. So this is nice that it works. Here we also have the advanced shipping notification, which combines multiple cartons into one order. So if Champs-Élysées would have ordered multiple cartons in one order, we could here click on this ASN number and would then get presented basically which cartons are associated with this advanced shipping notification, so that these arbitrary levels of abstraction are directly browsable in this global track and trace. So now that we know what the global track and trace is, what the PCIS is, RFID and an EPC is, what can we do with the data? Because just looking at it is nice, but I said before, we generate lots and lots of data, so we need to basically define our use cases. Why is it good to have this data? And there are 3 terms that I will define over the next few slides, which actually build the foundation for all analysis that have to do with this global track and trace. So the first one is accountability. Accountability stands for to be responsible, meaning we can actually track items along the supply chain and create awareness of responsibilities. So we can identify where an error occurred, and we can hold supply chain as well as retail partners accountable for mistakes. This can also serve as a proof of service, because we know that if we have read the cartons in or the correct target in the outbound, but inbound, something was wrong at the source, at the target location in inbound. We know that we have sent the correct articles, but something went wrong along the way to our target location. And actually knowing when and where an item was last seen dramatically speeds up clarification and accountability processes. So the second term is visibility. And visibility here refers to be able to see. And actually the slide should also say to be able to quantify, because this is something that in the past was rarely done, especially along the supply chain, because for fashion retailers, goods usually move along the supply chain in rather large quantities and cartons of lots and lots of items. So ordering t-shirts with quantities of more than 50 items are quite common. And it is, without RFID, it's rarely possible to actually account all items when they arrive in a distribution center, because distribution centers receive multiple thousands of items per day. And what we have is RFID tunnel installations that allow us to automatically process these cartons, identify shortages as well as surpluses, and we can make sure that the right quantities of items are actually sent to the desired target locations. So with a global track and trace, we can actually make every step along the supply chain visible. And as I said before, we can also provide a meaningful context so that you understand what actually happened at what step and where problems arise. And because we have target lists, we also can quantify the problem that is arising. Finally, traceability. Traceability refers in our case to be able to verify the history. And as I said before, with accountability, you want to know where was an item last seen. With traceability, you want to understand what was actually going on with my items. So you can inspect the history from the first street event that we have collected to the final sale until it was never returned. We can change layers of abstractions, so from item to carton to ASN level. We can actually also go back to the source, so material sourced from cotton farms, and using this traceability, or one use case for traceability would be if, for example, there was a production error with one of your, let's say one charge of cotton is contaminated with whatever substance and needs to be retracted, then you can simply trace this charge of cotton, identify where these articles went to, and instruct stores to actually remove those items without having to more or less completely shut down an article for a complete area. So the problems we can tackle with these properties is shrinkage, gray imports, and to some extent counterfeits. So for shrinkage, the scenario could be a DC orders 50 units of a specific t-shirt a given size, but in the end, only 40 sent out to stores. So if we would look at these problems from a visibility perspective, we would say 25 units have been sent from Atlanta, so this is the DC, to one store in Miami, and 15 units have been sent from Atlanta to Orlando. So right now, we still don't know where the problem actually is. Did the DC only receive 40 items? Is the DC still sitting on 10 items to be sent out? With traceability, on the other hand, we know that 50 units have been sent from the factory to Atlanta, so we have this history in our global track and trace. But only 45 units arrived, so something went wrong during transport. And with accountability, we know that the factory to DC transport, something happened, shrinkage of 5. And we also know DC to stores, something went wrong because we miss 5 items. So 5 items still in the DC, although 50 units should have been sent to the stores. As I said before, so for shrinkage, this is really important to properly understand. whenever we have an outbound scan in one location, we use this outbound scan as the target list for the inbound scan in the target location. So we know exactly what was going out and what we're expecting. And with the inbound scan, we verify that everything we have sent out actually arrives at the target location. If the target does not match the observed items, we actually have to audit the cartons or the items that are missing more or less in stores or in the distribution centers of factories. So basically, the processes that we use to monitor shrinkage is outbound performance, inbound performance. We also have pick and pack, which essentially is used in the distributions factories, where cartons actually are packed manually because the items are manufactured in the factory, so they have to be manually put into the cartons according to a given target list, which is usually an order by a store or a distribution center. Also have audit stations with reason codes. So workers in factories and distribution centers have to look at cartons where the target list does not match the actually read articles, and they have to provide reason codes for what was going on. So either an RFID tag was missing, or they are really short an article, or some item was double tagged and we have a surplus, so 2 RFID tags on one single item. Also, we have the goods receiving in stores, where again this scan happens. And as you can already imagine, there's lots of KPIs, lots of data aggregating in the back end in our system. So one thing that we have also learned, which is really, really important, is the KPI first approach. So our customers, the time of our customers is really valuable. And if you have to look at all the data that we are collecting, you will have problems really identifying the stuff that's important to you. So the identifying the actual problems. So by calculating KPIs and finding out where problems are, you can limit the amount of relevant cartons or relevant events that need to be inspected, and guide the user towards the data that they're actually interested in looking at. So for gray imports, gray imports essentially are goods that have been ordered outside of the manufacturer's authorized trading channels. This usually always has to do with retailers providing higher discounts than they normally could do because they buy their goods outside of the manufacturer's authorized trading channels, where they can get the items cheaper, so they can do higher discounts without actually making a loss. So in terms of visibility, you would see in one store that 15 units have been sold by a given store. But the interesting thing is with the traceability, because they're still viable or original items. 35 units were actually imported directly from retailers in Vietnam, and 15 of these sold at a discount in a given store in Miami. And this traceability now allows us to identify these gray imports, and this is actually quite important to protect brand value, and also the, let's say, article history. So the article history makes this accountability actually working. So in terms of counterfeits, it is possible to have RFID tags woven into garments of an article and deactivate those RFID tags on purchase. But usually this deactivation does not really take place. So given the scenario where an item has been returned or bought and the retailer wants to check for authenticity, there are several different options that could minimize the chance of this article being actually a counterfeit. So we could check if the EPC or RFID tag is still active, and if yes, we can check if the encoded EPC is actually valid, meaning if we scan it with our software, do we get a history? Do we get article information? If we get a history, we can check the history. Does this information that we retrieve match the information that, or actually looks somewhat plausible for the item that we have received? And here it's important to understand, again, these EPCs are unique. So the historic data in our system is always unique to the EPC, and we can actually check manually for anomalies, but we would need to have extensive knowledge about the supply chain to actually do that. So this brings me actually to the next point, which is automated anomaly detection. So when we talk about an anomaly, we always talk about a deviation from what we actually expected. If all the sites along the supply chain have implemented RFID, what would such a anomaly be? What could it be? And actually, there are several different scenarios or problematic situations which account as anomaly. To give you an example, if the same EPC is read in multiple locations within a small time window. So if we would read one EPC, for example, first at 8 o'clock in Miami, at 9 o'clock in Vienna in Austria, and then at 10 o'clock again in New York, then we would know that definitely something is up, and we should warn someone that either EPCs are not unique anymore, or something is wrong and up in the system that needs to be inspected. If the same EPC is returned or sold multiple times without the other event occurring in between, so multiple returns should also not happen. The same is true with multiple sales. There are, so because of the EPC, we can actually link the EPC to the corresponding SKU, and so product master data. And if certain articles are dedicated for a specific market and suddenly pop up in other markets, then this also indicates an anomaly that should be raised and highlighted. Also, losses along the supply chain, as we said before, if from the factory to the DC, very often articles vanish, then this is actually a reason to get concerned with and have a closer look into the transportation agency. Also, spikes in sales and returns actually provide information, or can be an anomaly, especially in spikes in returns, that should be highlighted so that someone can invest why these returns actually happen. So usually these heuristics that we use are derived from and updated via our big data streams, and we have supervised machine learning models trained on this supply chain data to classify such anomalies and highlight them when they actually occur. And this also brings me to a more data science-y topic, which is data-driven supply chain optimization. And here, the main focus is dwell times. So what is a dwell time? Basically, it's the time an item spends in a given state along the supply chain or in stores. So to give an example, an EPC is read at outbound from Atlanta at 10:31. And the EPC is read again at goods receiving at the store on the same day at 6:31. So if we would calculate dwell times, we would say that this specific EPC had a dwell time of 8 hours in status outbound. And on its own, this dwell time is not as interesting, but when you aggregate millions of dwell times along the supply chain, you can actually calculate a lot of probabilities and average values, deviations from those, and identify actually bottlenecks in your supply chain. To give you an example, when you have two comparable DCs or stores, the same area, which exhibit different or drastically different dwell times, actually you could advise store managers and or supply chain managers to have a closer look at these stores and check why our KPIs diverge as much as they actually do. And using these dwell times, we can also infer demand and trigger timely reordering. And this is actually only possible because of RFID. So one KPI that we are calculating is the sales floor exposure time. And this is the exact time an item is available on the sales floor before it's either sold or shipped to another store. This KPI is much more detailed than simple, the store has ordered 30 t-shirts, they received them on Monday, and 3 of them have been sold over the course of the next 2 weeks. Here we know exactly that the t-shirts actually were only put on the sales floor on Thursday of the second week, and all 3 of those t-shirts have been sold within 1 day, which actually shifts the perspective quite dramatically in terms of how well are these articles received. Additionally, we calculate out of stock on sales floor times, which refer to how long is an article out of stock in store and how long is an article out of stock on the sales floor, so not represented on the sales floor, but could be replenished. So, as I said before, these KPIs are only available due to RFID. The practical application here is combining these demand estimates with dwell times. We can automatically update our probabilistic models to issue timely reordering advices. So if you know that your items will only last you for another 2 days, and the reordering takes 1.5 days, you should actually already order or reorder the items from a DC, because it will take 1.5 days for them to arrive. Otherwise, you risk the chance of going out of stock of these items. This brings me also to store-to-store shipments. So they are mainly used to support omnichannel applications such as click and collect. But when we combine dwell times, customer demand, and also product life cycles, we can create store-to-store shipment devices. And those are actually important because we can shift inventories before end of season sales. And this is what you see in the lower right. Usually there are few articles in fashion retailers' inventories that are available all year round. Most of them are only available for a few months. And also few of them are only available for one specific month or very specific time. And to avoid these end of season sales, or to avoid selling off as much as you can before in these end of season sales, you want to do this store-to-store shipments. So you want to advise stores with high stock quantities of articles that do not sell well to actually ship these articles to stores where the article is going much better, has higher customer demand. And this also, and this is actually also quite important, minimizes DC and factory orders or production, which in the end still has to be sold off in end of season sales or, yeah. Okay, so the final KPI that we are looking at is throughput and bottleneck analysis that we can do. So because we cannot just calculate dwell times, meaning times between the different sites, but also times within a given site. So especially factories, DCs, and to some extent also stores. So throughput is the rate at which items are processed. And similar to dwell times, we can measure arrival and departure of items at sites along the supply chain. So if we have a DC that processes 24,000 cartons in the inbound on one day, 2,000 of these cartons had to be audited, but only 19,000 cartons departed this DC on the same day, meaning this DC has a throughput of roughly 90,000 cartons per day, but they actually received more cartons than they could process or send out. So this DC runs the risk of actually congesting. And at one point, if those numbers don't change over time, they will have to either increase the amount of tunnel installations and conveyor belts that they have, or talk to their suppliers so that they can actually meet or decrease the cartons that arrive every single day. But aside from these items received, items sent out, we can actually also get some additional insights or first insights using this throughput. So scrap and returns. And this is actually also possible because of the track and trace. So we know the amount of items that arrive at one location and that are actually sent back to the supplier or returned in stores, because we always have the sender-receiver challenge in our events, meaning we know how much of the cotton is actually going back to the supplier. We can do anomaly analysis, similar as I've shown before. If we see drastic increases or dips in performance, we can monitor this data. And even more important, we can trigger alerts and update our models that are further down in the supply chain so that we can update reorder advices accordingly. So if we know that the DC is more or less down and it takes 5 more additional days to actually get articles, we can already put in the reorder advices. And some coverage and failover KPIs. So combining throughput and dwell times, we can roughly estimate what area DC covers and can supply with items. And if demand rises, we either have to see basically which other DC can jump in as a failover if the DC has an outage, or if we can actually do store-to-store shipments to bridge this outage for some amount of time before the failover can actually get in place and replace or fill the demand of the DC that actually had an outage. And regarding bottlenecks, so we can actually represent the network of the sites along the supply chain as a network where we can enrich every single site with dwell times, throughput for stores, customer demand, several KPIs, just replenishment and sales information as well. And using this information, we can actually identify supply chain bottlenecks from historic data. So we can see if there are out of stock situations in stores where they would have very likely sold more articles if they would have had the option to actually get those. So one example could be that there were high demand articles with limited availability due to limited throughput in factories, as well as dwell time problems in DCs. And this is information that we have already frequently uncovered and is actually actionable information that can be taken care of if you are aware that they exist. Further, we can also run simulations to estimate the impact of DC and factory outages and create failover plans so that you have a guaranteed manufacturing as well as reordering times along your supply chain. Okay, so finally, I will speak a little bit about our experience and the conclusions in terms of global track and trace and how it works in the wild. So as I said in the beginning, we have several customers that use the global track and trace in production. And most of them, when they approach us and say that they want this system, tell us that they want this system, they want to create this system on their own. Usually what happens then is that they are let's say, overwhelmed with the amount of data that they have to process and store. Also the costs associated with the hardware and all the data that needs to be stored. Then you need to have very, very fast processing pipelines for KPIs. So to give you an example, if your DC goes down, runs into a problem, if your processing pipeline takes 3 days to process the data, that's not fast enough, because very likely a worker in the DC will have already raised this problem. But the main goal should be that you actually become aware of the problem before it is raised to the DC. Also, one very, very big problem that everyone who works with big data and in general such a global track and trace needs to be aware of is that you have to add meaning to the data. And if you have to sift through all the data without filtering the data, without having means of directing your attention toward a very specific area that needs your attention, then it becomes very, very tricky to actually find what you're looking for. Also, just so I've mentioned it again, big data means ingesting and managing terabytes, petabytes of data, and all of this more or less in real time. Another experience or lesson that we've learned is EPCIS is not enough. So EPC information is very nice, but it's too granular to get this overview, to get this bigger picture of what's going on in your data. And very, very important is this KPI first approach. You want to direct your attention towards a specific area, specific slice of your data, so that you can actually learn something from the data. And what's also important is not everyone is actually interested in the same data. So operations is interested in real-time data, performance of the tunnel, performance of the audit stations. Management is interested in actually getting outlooks and high-level information of the data. So to conclude, with a global track and trace, everyone who has a global track and trace has the means to quantify the performance of the supply chain, making everything visible. We can identify the last known location of items, which yields accountability. We know who should be responsible for what and where things went wrong. And we can inspect history of items and even raw materials so that we can know where our articles actually came from. So this is traceability. And all these qualities allow then the extraction of several different KPIs and models to monitor shrinkage, identify gray imports, all the things we have talked before. But one take-home message, maybe if you're planning on introducing such a system to your company, is try to partner up with a company that has already done it, because you will immensely profit from that knowledge. You need standardized interfaces. You need to know several quirks and kinks about how to get everything deployed along the supply chain. And the best possible option for every company out there would be to slowly transition into this solution so that you're not overwhelmed by all the data that's coming in, and that you can slowly start. So if you use RFID only your stores, then you can start by actually looking at the stores and how useful the track and trace is there. Then you extend it to DCs, and from there you extend it to factories, and from factories you extend it to manufacturing. So this slow transition is also very, very important if you want to implement such a global track and trace, because usually if you do everything at once, it will be a very rough learning curve for everyone involved to really drill down into the data and the KPIs that you want to look at. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And otherwise, that's all from my side.